Dawn rose cold and steady over the North Pacific as the carrier Akagi cut a silent path through gray water. On its flight deck, Commander Minoru Genda watched the second wave of aircraft fade into the southern sky toward Oahu. He had spent 11 months sharpening the plan until it felt like a blade that could not miss. He could sketch Pearl Harbor from memory. He could list American destroyers like a quartermaster. He could recite aircraft counts and runway lengths as if they were verses. Every contingency had been weighed and reweighed. Every angle felt precise. Yet beneath the surface, a single invisible current was already pulling the future in a direction no plan could correct. Intelligence had given him volumes. Reconnaissance photographs traced the harbor's geometry. Shipping registers outlined keels, tonnage, and commissioning dates. Attaché reports in Washington fed a steady drip of policy gossip and technical chatter. Genda trusted the scaffolding. He trusted the arithmetic of hulls, squadrons, and miles. What he could not see, and what his peers could not admit, was that the equation depended on a wrong constant. The wrong constant lived in the headcount that manned those ships, trained those air crews, loaded those magazines, and patched those ruptured bulkheads when fire finally came. Months earlier, a different link in the chain moved with equal discipline. Ensign Takeo Yoshikawa stepped onto the Honolulu docks under a borrowed name. He studied, recorded, and walked away without leaving a ripple. He took the harbor tour and counted silently as the guide talked and the water lapped the pilings. He rented a small plane and learned the base from above, noting where shadows fell across oil tanks and where roads cut through the cane fields. He memorized patrol rhythms, the slow turning of searchlights, the idle hours of watch crews, the trucks that never seemed to stop at the same time twice. His dispatches were careful and specific. His confidence rested on craft rather than bravado. He sent home a portrait that was accurate in every line except the one that mattered most. In Tokyo, the reports piled into neat folders. Staff officers graded them, tabulated them, and turned them into force estimates. They counted carriers and assigned crews based on standards they knew well. Their own ships ran lean, crews drilled to carry heavy loads with minimal hands. Efficiency was a habit. Redundancy felt wasteful. When they mapped that habit onto the American fleet, the results slid into spreadsheets without resistance. The math balanced because the inputs reflected a mirror, not a foreign sea. Far from the counting rooms, the United States was moving at a different tempo. Shipyards were busy in ways that technical journals could quantify but culture could not translate. Recruiting stations broadened their hours. Training commands grew from tidy depots into cities with barracks like fields of grain. The pipeline bent space and time. 8 weeks for basic. A few months more for technical schools. Then out to sea under officers who themselves had been commissioned by classes that multiplied every season. The system was designed to scale. It rewarded throughput without surrendering structure. It accepted that fatigue and inexperience would appear and planned to drown both in sheer volume and relentless drilling. None of that was obvious on the morning Genda watched the sky. What he saw looked exactly like a decisive first move. The torpedo wakes would be quick and straight. The bomb blasts would write their captions in black smoke. The message to Washington and to the Pacific would appear unambiguous. Yet even here, hints of the deeper story cut through the noise. The very design of American ships revealed a philosophy beyond ordnance and armor. Compartmentation favored survival. Fire mains ran with redundancy. Workshops were thick with spares. These details altered the slope of a curve that intelligence officers had drawn too shallow. If damage control is a function of people and practice, then crews matter as much as steel. The signs had been present for years in data no one truly believed. Census figures listed a population that dwarfed Japan's. Industrial surveys wrote about payrolls, shift patterns, and apprenticeship programs. Naval yearbooks logged ship counts with footnotes about complement size that seemed generous to the point of waste. Captured manuals spoke of manning tables that analysts in Tokyo quietly trimmed to match their experience of what was sensible. The trimming felt like prudence. It was in fact the subtraction that turned a war plan into a story with a fixed ending. When Yoshikawa peered through a camera lens from his rental plane, he was not wrong about what lay below. He saw battleships and cruisers arranged like chess pieces. He saw carriers that looked like thunderheads parked on the sea. He saw the rhythm of harbor life that made him think he understood tempo and capacity. He could not see the invisible crews that rotated through schools at Great Lakes, San Diego, and Norfolk, or the fact that those schools were designed to push through tens of thousands month after month. Through no fault of his own, he was drawing conclusions from a surface that hid its depth. Inside the Naval General Staff, responsibility for long-range planning rested on officers who thought in schedules, not in tides. They tracked steel deliveries, slipway availabilities, and the time it took to teach a man to keep a boiler alive during a storm. They reasoned that their own growth curve represented the limits of human institutions engaged in modern war. They assessed that the United States would grow as they would grow, cautiously, carefully, with elite standards throttling scale. This was mirror imaging in its cleanest form. It turned a foreign adversary into an echo of the self. It made risk look reasonable because it shrank the enemy to fit a familiar frame. By the time the first bombs struck Ford Island and Battleship Row, the calculus had already failed. The numbers that mattered were not the ships sunk in the initial hours, but the people who would replace the people who were lost. The pipelines that would backfill squadrons. The training cadres that would expand again and again without hitting a wall. The dockyards that would patch and overhaul while launching new hulls in a cadence that accelerated under pressure. In this kind of war, mass did not simply add. It compounded. Genda, who had mastered every detail he could control, now found himself living inside an equation whose hidden term would take months to reveal itself. Early victories would be dramatic and real. They would paint maps with new boundaries and lift spirits in war rooms. Yet each success would also generate the next proof that his side had measured the wrong thing. The enemy would not run out of sailors. The enemy would not choose between theaters. The enemy would build forces in parallel, and the result would be a pressure that rose invisibly until it crested. Far away, amid snow and wind on Lake Michigan, recruits marched in files while instructors barked cadence that no one in Tokyo could hear. In San Diego, torches flared along the frames of escort vessels. In New Jersey and California, assembly lines learned to treat ships like trains of parts instead of one-off masterpieces. In Illinois, the Great Lakes Station eased another wave through mess halls and classrooms, each name a line on a ledger that no Japanese planner had credited correctly. The chain that began with a signature at a recruiting desk ended months later as a hand on a valve, a body on a hose, a mind tracing a circuit breaker in smoke and heat. That chain would multiply until it spanned oceans. The second wave aircraft rolled home toward Akagi as the morning brightened. On paper, the raids had struck exactly as planned. Graphs would soon climb in boardrooms that craved proof of concept. Yet the thing that would decide the war was not in any of those graphs. It lived inside the gap between a lean Manning table and an American complement swollen on purpose. It spread through training depots laid out like factory towns. It moved with the rhythm of a country that could turn civilians into sailors fast enough to make math feel like destiny. Somewhere in that rhythm, a truth waited to be recognized, and by the time anyone tried to write it down, events would already be following its lead. By early spring of 1941, a quiet rhythm pulsed beneath the calm of diplomatic courtesies. In Honolulu, the man calling himself Tadashi Morimura lived in a world balanced between civility and espionage. Each morning, he dressed like any polite visitor, exchanged bows, and walked into sunlight that revealed nothing of his purpose. Behind his calm expression, Takeo Yoshikawa carried the burden of memory so sharp it was almost a weapon. He studied the harbor from public hills, counted silhouettes through glass, traced flight paths from the faint hum of engines returning at dusk. He recorded facts that would one day send waves of aircraft south toward the island he now admired in silence. His reports traveled by coded cable, then across desks where officers in Tokyo read with a confidence that felt like control. They saw in his numbers the outline of a contained adversary. To them, America looked large but slow, wealthy but complacent, a nation without the discipline to sustain total war. They measured sailors as if discipline were fixed to national character. They compared systems as if philosophy could be converted to arithmetic. The result was a map of strength that looked tidy, rational, and deeply wrong. The error did not come from absence of data. Japanese naval intelligence possessed reports that hinted at the truth. Merchant sailors spoke of crowded shipyards and new facilities along both coasts. Technical magazines listed training capacities and recruitment incentives. Even intercepted radio chatter carried traces of a mobilization machine in motion. Yet the analysts who handled these fragments filtered them through experience shaped by their own navy. In that navy, growth was methodical, careers were lifelong, and expansion meant careful selection rather than mass enlistment. What they could not imagine, they quietly discarded. The first field signs appeared months before the raid that made the world tremble. Submarines patrolling near Midway reported unfamiliar convoy patterns. Air reconnaissance photographed auxiliary vessels in numbers too high to match official expectations. Officers noted the discrepancies and filed them under anomalies. The anomalies grew into patterns, but no one connected them. The institution valued operational momentum over analytical discomfort. Doubt slowed planning, and planning was sacred. When December came, the roar of engines over Pearl Harbor carried more than explosives. It carried the full weight of those unchecked assumptions. Flames climbed skyward while the ocean filled with oil slicks, and at home the message reached Tokyo like a confirmation of faith. The blow had landed. The gamble seemed justified. Yet even then, somewhere in the static, the first counterweight began to form. For every aircraft destroyed in that morning's chaos, 2 replacements were already under construction, and crews were already in training halls that stretched for miles. The months that followed built on triumph. Maps in command centers filled with red lines marking new territories. Radio bulletins spoke of victory as if momentum were destiny. But each success carried a hidden cost. It deepened the illusion that America was bleeding. The truth was stranger. Factories once idle now ran around the clock. Assembly lines refined their rhythm until output climbed faster than planners could update forecasts. The country's industrial network behaved less like a collection of plants and more like an organism learning to move. Inside the Japanese high command, the first cracks appeared in whispers. A few officers questioned how American fleets kept reappearing in full strength after each battle. Some suspected exaggerated reports. Others wondered if reinforcements were being diverted from Europe. The idea that America could expand both theaters simultaneously was dismissed as unrealistic. The same reasoning that had created the original miscalculation now protected it from revision. By the summer of 1942, observation had turned to disbelief. During the Battle of the Coral Sea, Japanese scouts saw a task force larger than any previous estimate allowed. Logistical ships trailed in steady intervals, signaling a depth of support that made no sense. After the clash, analysts recalculated, only to find the numbers refused to fit. They noted the inconsistency, labeled it temporary, and moved on. Then came Midway. In the aftermath of disaster, fragments of American documents drifted among the wreckage. Among them was a crew list from the carrier Yorktown. The tally showed more than 2,000 names. To Japanese eyes, that number was absurd. A carrier that size required 1,500 men at most. The evidence defied doctrine, yet it was undeniable. It hinted at a truth too large to absorb. The Americans manned their ships not for efficiency but for endurance. The Yorktown's survival after heavy damage offered further proof. Reports described fires contained within hours, power restored, and flight operations resumed the same afternoon. Such recovery demanded manpower far beyond Japanese standards. Even so, Tokyo dismissed the incident as an outlier, a story distorted by rumor. What they could not explain, they refused to believe. Beyond the ocean, another story unfolded in silence. At Great Lakes, recruits arrived by the tens of thousands, shivering in winter wind while instructors shouted over frozen decks. In California, steel frames rose under floodlights. In Virginia, classrooms filled with new cadets who had been civilians mere weeks before. The entire system pulsed with acceleration. It did not wait for perfection. It built capacity until mistakes became statistically irrelevant. That was the shape of a different kind of strength, the strength of scale. Inside Japan, the rhythm of expansion remained measured. Training schools struggled to replace skilled pilots. Maintenance crews grew slowly because each specialist required years of preparation. The contrast was invisible day to day but devastating over time. When intelligence officers compared growth curves, they saw what they expected: modest increases that matched their sense of realism. They mistook realism for truth. In this gulf between perception and reality, history began to tilt. The Japanese war plan rested on the belief that the enemy would exhaust itself before reaching the perimeter. But exhaustion never came. Instead, the horizon filled with silhouettes, ships built faster than charts could update, aircraft ferried in endless convoys, crews that seemed to materialize out of the sea itself. The weight of that unseen number pressed forward, patient and unstoppable. And still, within conference rooms lined with maps and smoke, planners traced new offensives as if arithmetic could be forced to obedience. They did not yet realize that the war's outcome had already been written in the miscount of sailors they had never seen. The truth waited beneath the surface, vast and silent, moving toward them like a tide no command could reverse. In Tokyo, the rhythm of confidence continued long after the smoke cleared over Hawaii. The war planners who once measured tides and hulls now measured progress in miles of conquered territory. Their charts looked promising, and their mathematics still made sense, but only because the wrong variables had been locked in place. Intelligence officers sat at narrow desks beneath the glare of electric lamps, reading cables that described American movements too rapid to align with earlier estimates. Some felt unease, but unease was not policy. The empire's momentum seemed unstoppable, and momentum had its own gravity. Among the quiet skeptics was Captain Toshikazu Omiya, a man who had studied American naval practices for years. He understood their appetite for logistics, their fascination with procedure, and the depth of their industrial roots. Yet when he attempted to raise doubts about personnel figures, his reports met the soft resistance of hierarchy. The data was reviewed, discussed, and then buried beneath layers of optimism. The institution's pride became its armor, and that armor turned every warning into a dull sound that faded before reaching the surface. The flaw had a name that few dared to speak: mirror imaging. It was not deception but reflection. Each analyst looked across the ocean and saw an enemy that resembled themselves. They believed that other navies must think the same way, train the same way, and value the same things. The Japanese Navy, shaped by a culture of mastery, trusted in precision over volume. Every sailor was the product of long apprenticeship and tradition. The idea that another country could replace that process with mass mobilization seemed unthinkable. To them, speed meant dilution. Quantity meant weakness. So when reports described American shipyards launching vessels at a rate of dozens per month, intelligence officers adjusted the data to fit their worldview. They reasoned that ships built so quickly must lack quality, that crews trained so briefly must lack skill. Their estimates were not merely numbers but reflections of faith, in the superiority of discipline, in the limits of human training, and in the certainty that no nation could outwork the laws of experience. What they failed to see was that industry had rewritten those laws. By mid-1942, Japan's expansion reached its widest sweep. Yet with every new island captured, the strain deepened. Supply lines stretched thin. Fuel reserves tightened. Replacement pilots arrived slower than planes fell. And still, Tokyo believed the Americans faced the same limits. They imagined an adversary bound by the same physics of preparation and recovery. It was a comforting illusion, reinforced by their own culture of endurance. Where willpower was sacred, they assumed willpower was universal currency. In Washington, the war machine had become a pulse that filled the continent. Every month, new drafts of men flowed through induction centers. Universities transformed into technical schools. Factories converted to barracks between shifts. The machinery of democracy proved capable of manufacturing not only weapons but competence. Every few months, an entire generation of sailors stepped from train stations onto bases that operated like cities. Each one learned fast, not because standards were lower, but because training itself had become an industry, repeatable, measurable, and scalable. The Japanese did not understand that scale could create its own form of excellence. They still imagined a pyramid, with a narrow top of experts supporting a small, elite base. The Americans had built something closer to a plain, wide, resilient, and endlessly replenished. When a carrier sank, its air groups reappeared on a new deck within weeks. When destroyers fell to torpedoes, replacements left shipyards before the wrecks cooled. To Tokyo's planners, these events looked impossible. They treated each as an exception, not a pattern. By the autumn of 1942, reports from the South Pacific began to tell another story. Guadalcanal had become a crucible where the hidden arithmetic of war finally surfaced. Japanese intelligence had expected a modest landing, perhaps a few thousand Marines at most. Instead, they watched through scattered reports as the numbers swelled past 16,000. Supporting fleets filled the horizon, their crews numbering in the tens of thousands more. Supply convoys ran in steady columns across the night sea, guarded by destroyers that seemed to replace themselves as fast as they were lost. The figures no longer fit any prior model. Something fundamental had shifted, though few yet grasped what. Admiral Yamamoto, far from the front, read the situation with a growing sense of inevitability. He had lived among Americans once, studied in their universities, listened to their humor, and seen their factories up close. He knew the rhythm of their abundance, the patience of their process. From his desk, he watched the impossible become routine, and he understood that the mistake had been more than numerical, it was cultural. Japan had not miscounted men. It had misunderstood a civilization. Still, the machinery of belief turned like gears that could not disengage. Orders moved downward, battles moved forward, and corrections waited in files that no one dared circulate widely. Intelligence divisions gathered fragments, prisoner statements, intercepted communications, the sighting of too many ships in too many places, but the implications threatened more than strategies. They threatened identity. To accept the truth meant to accept that the very measure of power had changed, that precision could be defeated by mass, and that devotion could be outpaced by organization. As the year closed, ships still sailed, and banners still declared victory. Yet within those victories, silence spread. It was the silence of realization, half-formed and unspoken, the recognition that something enormous had been set in motion far beyond calculation. The reflection in the mirror no longer resembled the image it was meant to copy. And by the time anyone admitted that, the reflection had already grown into a storm that would not stop until it reached every shore. By the beginning of 1943, the sea had changed its texture. Every horizon seemed to carry the faint outline of more ships, and every rumor from the Pacific came wrapped in disbelief. Japanese observers watched task forces that should not exist, fleets assembled faster than new maps could be printed. What had begun as an error of calculation was now visible in steel and wake lines, proof written in movement. Intelligence officers in Tokyo were running out of ways to explain the impossible. The first official re-examination came quietly. A team within the Naval Intelligence Division began to collect every fragment of evidence gathered over the previous 18 months. They sifted through submarine logs, coded intercepts, and reports from captured prisoners. Each scrap of data pointed to the same unsettling conclusion: the United States Navy was expanding at a speed that defied every prior estimate. The math was blunt. By their own conservative count, American forces already exceeded 800,000 men. Adjusted for manning standards gleaned from captured manuals, the total rose to over 1 million. It was a number too large for habit to accept. The officers wrote their findings carefully, couching each figure in cautious language. They understood that numbers had political weight. A mistake that large was not merely analytical, it was institutional. It meant that the empire's war plan rested on sand. When the report reached senior leaders, debate flared, then softened into rationalization. Some argued that the Americans must have stripped their Atlantic defenses. Others insisted that mass recruitment would breed inefficiency, that the numbers were real but hollow. Denial became a form of strategy. Far from Tokyo, the proof continued to multiply. At Guadalcanal, American resupply operations unfolded with mechanical precision. Convoys arrived in layers, each replacing the last before the sea could empty. Japanese submarines stalked them, counting hulls and sending totals that stunned analysts. Merchant vessels appeared to operate under military discipline, their crews well-trained, their escort patterns textbook perfect. Every convoy suggested an organization that had learned to make war not through brilliance but through system. Among the few who understood what this meant was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. In the quiet hours before dawn, he studied the flow of reports and saw a pattern that would not bend. The enemy's strength was not localized, it was structural. He wrote directly to the Naval General Staff, warning that American naval power had already surpassed all estimates. His words were sharp, but bureaucracy dulled their edge. The institution that had underestimated the enemy now could not bear to overcorrect. Within months, the illusion began to fracture at the front. Commanders in the Solomon Islands asked for replacements they could not have. Ships sailed with half-trained crews. Maintenance backlogs grew. Every loss echoed longer, every victory felt thinner. Yet the empire moved forward because movement was all it knew. The war demanded momentum, even if momentum led toward exhaustion. In the United States, the opposite was true. The machinery of mobilization accelerated like a factory conveyor. Training centers grew new wings overnight. The Great Lakes Station processed 20,000 recruits each month, and similar bases dotted the country. Every sailor represented more than a body, he was a node in a vast design, a unit that could be replaced, improved, multiplied. The system was indifferent to fatigue or fear. It ran on the logic of scale. Japanese intelligence officers began to glimpse this truth through interrogations. One captured radio operator spoke freely of his training, describing facilities that turned civilians into sailors by the thousands. The numbers sounded absurd to his interrogators. They assumed mistranslation or exaggeration. The possibility that the prisoner's story was simple fact did not fit the frame of the possible. Yet within weeks, corroboration arrived from the other side of the world. A German submarine commander's report described American escort ships with crews nearly double Japanese standards. What had been rumor became evidence. By September, a new working group was formed. Their task was to start from zero, to estimate American strength without reference to old assumptions. They worked in secret for 6 weeks, counting sightings, triangulating radio traffic, and mapping the industrial rhythm of an opponent they could no longer deny. When they finished, their projection was almost unbearable. They estimated 1,800,000 sailors in service, growing toward 2,400,000 by mid-1944. Even this conservative figure meant the empire's entire strategy was obsolete. The report's tone was clinical, but its message was fatal. If the numbers were correct, America could sustain simultaneous campaigns across both oceans. It could absorb losses that would end Japan's ability to fight and still expand. Attrition itself had become an American weapon. The authors knew what their discovery meant, but they also knew the cost of admitting it aloud. They filed their conclusions under the highest classification and sealed the documents away. Outside, winter approached. Factories in Yokosuka and Kure worked through the night, turning out ships that would never be replaced once lost. The air smelled of iron and exhaustion. In conference rooms, admirals studied maps of the Central Pacific, unaware that the tide beneath those maps had already turned. Across the ocean, in shipyards filled with light, welders worked in shifts that never ended. Steel plates fell into place, rivets clattered like rainfall, and fresh crews rehearsed on decks still smelling of paint. Every hour added weight to a scale that no longer balanced. The war, still roaring across the headlines, had already decided its direction in silence. It had been decided not by courage or cunning but by arithmetic, the kind that could not be rewritten by hope. November arrived in Tokyo with a chill that crept through corridors lined with maps. In one of those rooms, a handful of officers finished a report that none of them wanted to write. The paper carried figures that felt like fiction, though each number had been cross-checked and confirmed. They had counted every American ship sighted, every radio call intercepted, every captured manual studied under lamplight. The arithmetic told a story that stripped away illusion. The United States Navy had not doubled or tripled its strength. It had multiplied sevenfold. The officers wrote in a tone so restrained it felt like whispering. They understood the risk of truth. Their analysis concluded that America now possessed the capacity to fight in two oceans at once, with fleets large enough to replace every loss and still expand. Their projection for the coming year reached nearly 2.5 million sailors. For Japan, that number was a storm beyond calculation. It erased every strategy that depended on exhaustion, every plan that assumed an enemy would tire. When the report reached the upper echelons, reactions split in silence. Some officers stared at the pages for long minutes without speaking. Others traced the columns with fingers that trembled slightly before they found words to deflect the meaning. The numbers must be exaggerated. Perhaps American record-keeping inflated totals. Perhaps they counted civilian workers or merchant crews. The logic of denial was soothing, even as it rang hollow. To accept the truth would have been to admit that the war could not be won. The report moved upward, stamped and sealed with the highest level of secrecy. Distribution was restricted to fewer than 20 people. Outside that narrow circle, no one knew that the entire foundation of strategy had shifted. No public correction followed, no change of course. Planning continued as if the empire still held time as its ally. In that decision to continue as before, the outcome of the war was sealed more tightly than any coded message. Far from Tokyo, in the Pacific, reality revealed itself in movement. Convoys moved with a precision that resembled inevitability. American carriers appeared in pairs, then in groups, then in fleets so large that Japanese spotters could not count them before night fell. Every time Japan struck, the sea filled again. Each sunk destroyer had a twin on the horizon. Each carrier replaced within months, manned by crews whose training seemed endless. Within Japan's own navy, cracks widened. Fuel shortages began to choke operations. Training squadrons shrank as pilots were reassigned to combat units. Maintenance suffered as skilled mechanics were lost. Factories could not keep up. For every ship Japan repaired, America launched 10 new ones. For every pilot Japan graduated, America trained 100. The equation no longer required tactics or chance. It had become a machine that ran on scale. In Washington, that machine was visible everywhere. Cities pulsed with new uniforms. Highways carried columns of trucks filled with recruits bound for coastal bases. The Great Lakes Training Station alone processed 240,000 men a year. Other centers mirrored it, running day and night. To Japanese planners, such numbers still sounded like myth. Yet they were written in payroll ledgers, visible to anyone who cared to read the right lines. In Tokyo, Admiral Shimada read the report again under the dim light of his office. The words were factual, the tone clinical, but the meaning pressed like weight on the chest. The empire had entered a war that arithmetic alone had already decided. He knew that revealing such truth would mean collapse, of confidence, of structure, of faith itself. He chose silence. The report was archived, the conclusions unspoken, and the fleet continued to sail. Outside, the wind shifted from the sea, carrying the faint smell of smoke and winter iron. In that wind lay the sound of factories an ocean away, still building, still training, still multiplying. The war that began in boldness was now turning into a contest of endurance, and only one side possessed the means to endure. The numbers were no longer hidden in documents. They were taking shape across the horizon. Winter slipped into spring, and with it came the first tremors of something irreversible. The sea that had once been Japan's arena was now the United States Navy's factory floor. Ships did not appear as isolated silhouettes anymore. They arrived in clusters, columns, and armadas. Each battle group looked like a fragment of something larger, a moving piece of an industrial rhythm that stretched back across an entire continent. The tide had turned, but not through chance or genius. It turned through mathematics, through the simple weight of numbers that refused to bend. In the South Pacific, the sound of engines filled the air day and night. Carriers operated like mobile cities. Supply ships sailed in endless lines, delivering fuel, ammunition, and food with the regularity of freight trains. Each convoy carried not just cargo but the quiet confidence of a nation that knew replacement was always waiting. Japan still fought with courage, still struck with precision, but each success was swallowed almost instantly by replacement and renewal. The Americans had learned to treat loss as a cost already accounted for. At sea, Japanese captains began to sense the imbalance even before intelligence confirmed it. A destroyer sunk meant a void that would never be filled. A carrier damaged meant a shadow across future operations. When ships limped home for repairs, the docks felt emptier, the workers fewer. Messages from Tokyo carried optimism that no longer matched the faces in the engine rooms. The truth could not be hidden from those who saw the sea every day. They knew in their bones that the enemy had grown too vast to measure. In June of 1944, the Battle of the Philippine Sea tore away the last illusion. Japan committed nearly everything that remained of its carrier fleet, hoping for a decisive blow. The sky filled with planes, the ocean with smoke. Yet when the thunder faded, the balance was clear. Japan lost 3 carriers and hundreds of aircraft, along with the irreplaceable pilots who flew them. The Americans lost a few dozen planes, machines soon replaced by the hundreds waiting on the mainland. Their carriers resumed flight operations within hours, as if the battle had been a drill rather than a disaster. That day, one task force alone, 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers, carried nearly 70,000 men. That single formation equaled nearly a fifth of Japan's entire naval personnel at the war's beginning. And it was only one among many. Across the Pacific, identical fleets were moving simultaneously, supported by logistics chains that wrapped around the world. For every ship Japan could see, there were others building, training, or already steaming toward another horizon. Inside Japan, silence began to spread in places where voices once argued. Intelligence officers knew their predictions had come true. Operations staff knew that no adjustment in tactics could reverse what was happening. But the machinery of war had no reverse gear. Ships already under construction had to be launched. Units already deployed had to fight. To stop would mean acknowledging defeat, and the empire was not built to speak that word aloud. Factories still glowed at night, though the light grew dimmer as resources dwindled. Pilots still trained, though their courses shortened and their fuel rations thinned. Each new recruit filled the space of one who would not return, and each returning ship carried fewer faces than before. The war that had begun with precision and pride now moved forward on inertia alone. And across the ocean, an entire nation kept building, its assembly lines humming with the rhythm of inevitability. The sea had become arithmetic. Every wave that rolled west carried proof of it. Proof that the difference between 300,000 sailors and 2,300,000 was not a statistic but a destiny. Japan's commanders could still plan operations, still circle targets on maps, but the maps no longer mattered. The outcome was written in tonnage, in manpower, in the simple truth that one side could replace what it lost faster than the other could count the losses. The tide was no longer turning. It had turned and it would never turn back. By the closing months of 1944, Japan's admirals no longer asked whether victory was possible. The question had shifted to how long they could delay the inevitable. The maps still hung on the walls, and the pins still marked territories, but every new line drawn was a thread unraveling another piece of the empire. The air raids came more often now, the nights lit by fires that spread faster than the alarms. Still, inside the Naval Ministry, officers spoke in the language of strategy, as though the right arrangement of words could push the tide back. The intelligence files, those that contained the unvarnished truth, remained locked away. Only a handful of people had ever read them. Those who had, carried the knowledge like a quiet sickness. They knew that the empire had walked into a war already lost in the realm of arithmetic. They knew that the error was not hidden in missing data, but in the refusal to believe what the data said. The Real defeat had come years earlier, the moment when the institution decided that reality could be reshaped by faith. Admiral Shigetaro Shimada still held the reins of the Navy, his posture straight even as the corridors emptied. He had seen the report that projected American strength beyond imagination, millions of sailors, fleets that could multiply across oceans. He knew what those numbers meant, but he also knew the danger of confession. To admit the truth was to shatter morale, to unravel the command structure, to reveal that the empire's foundation was built on illusion. So he chose to carry the weight in silence. The report was sealed again, its copies destroyed except for a few that survived through chance. In the Pacific, the silence translated into movement. American ships advanced in long, synchronized arcs, each task force operating with the confidence of infinite supply. New airfields appeared overnight on captured islands, their runways stretching like veins toward the next target. Fuel and ammunition followed with mechanical precision. What Japan once saw as distant threats were now daily realities. The Americans fought as if they had no limit, as if the ocean itself had become their factory floor. At sea, Japanese crews could feel the imbalance even before the enemy appeared. Supplies arrived late. Replacement parts grew scarce. Orders changed faster than ships could refuel. The rhythm of command, once measured and methodical, turned frantic. Men who had once spoken of honor and victory now spoke of endurance. Battles were no longer contests of skill, they were acts of defiance against the inevitable. In the cities, the truth leaked through whispers. Families heard of sons lost aboard ships whose names were never printed. Factories that once rang with hammers now echoed with air raid sirens. Teachers urged children to believe in final victory, even as the sky outside their classrooms filled with the sound of distant engines. The empire's narrative held for the moment, but belief had begun to fray. Across the ocean, in places the Japanese public could not imagine, the machinery of the American war effort continued to swell. New recruits filled barracks faster than uniforms could be issued. Carriers sailed from ports already building their replacements. The factories no longer celebrated milestones. They counted progress by tonnage, by output per hour, by precision in repetition. The system had evolved beyond ambition. It ran now on momentum and mathematics, powered by a nation that had learned how to turn abundance into endurance. By the start of 1945, the reports from the front no longer required interpretation. They read like echoes of that hidden intelligence document from 2 years before, each one another line of proof that the predictions had been right. Yet still, the leadership held its silence. There was no admission, no shift in policy, no public reckoning. The truth had been buried too deep to unearth without destroying everything that rested above it. The war moved forward because it could not stop. The fleets that once symbolized pride now sailed as ghosts of an empire that had forgotten how to retreat. Beneath the banners and the slogans, everyone who understood the numbers knew that the end was approaching. They knew it in the way the sea seemed to widen, in the way the horizon stayed empty no matter how far they looked. The silence was not denial anymore. It was resignation dressed as resolve. By the summer of 1945, the Pacific was no longer a battlefield of equals. It was a theater where inevitability performed its final act. The American fleets stretched from horizon to horizon, their carriers lined like floating cities, their decks alive with motion. Every dawn brought the hum of aircraft engines, and every night the faint glow of shipyards still producing replacements for machines not yet lost. The ocean had become an assembly line, its rhythm set by a nation that understood war as production rather than passion. For Japan, there was no longer a line between bravery and futility. The Imperial Navy that had once struck fear across the Pacific was now a shadow of itself. Ships sailed with skeleton crews. Pilots trained on simulators fashioned from wooden frames because there was no fuel to fly. Radios crackled with static instead of coordination. The great fleet that had once gathered under banners of destiny now scattered, hiding in inlets and coves, waiting for orders that could no longer change the outcome. In the cities, the air itself had turned into a weapon. The hum of bombers overhead became a daily sound, familiar as the morning bells once were. Flames rolled through Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya, leaving only blackened grids where neighborhoods used to stand. Yet even in that ruin, the machinery of secrecy held firm. The public still heard words of defiance, of inevitable victory, of the emperor's unbroken will. The numbers that proved otherwise remained locked in drawers that no one dared open. When the Americans reached Okinawa, the war's logic became undeniable. The sheer scale of men and machines defied imagination. There were more ships supporting that single operation than the entire Japanese fleet had possessed at the height of its power. The beaches were crowded not by desperate recruits but by divisions trained, equipped, and rotated as if part of a vast, unending cycle. Japan's resistance was fierce and unyielding, but every sacrifice added to a statistic that could not be reversed. The arithmetic of attrition had completed its equation. In the ruins of the Naval Ministry, a few officers gathered one last time. The air smelled of smoke and paper. They spoke quietly, each knowing the truth without naming it. The Empire had waged a war against a mirror image of itself, not against the real America. They had believed the enemy would mobilize with the same limits, the same discipline, the same reverence for slow mastery. They had believed quality would overcome quantity. But in the end, the war had been decided not by courage or tactics but by an equation: 2 million sailors against 300,000, one industrial continent against an island nation already drained. When surrender came, it did not feel like a moment. It felt like the slow fading of sound after an explosion. The ships stopped moving. The flags lowered. The broadcasts changed tone. The same rooms that had once echoed with orders now held only the rustle of papers being boxed and sealed. Somewhere in those boxes lay the original intelligence reports, the ones that had predicted everything, the ones that had been hidden to preserve the illusion of control. The truth had been discovered too early to change the future and too late to save the present. Years later, when interrogators asked surviving officers how such a miscalculation could happen, the answers circled the same center: pride, tradition, hierarchy, belief. The refusal to see an enemy who thought differently. The inability to imagine a world where speed replaced refinement, where organization outweighed heroism. The men who had once commanded fleets spoke softly, describing how information had been gathered but never believed, how facts had been buried beneath conviction. They were no longer defending decisions, they were describing inevitability. In the end, history recorded numbers: ships sunk, men lost, victories won and lost. But beneath those numbers lived another set: the difference between what was known and what was accepted, between what intelligence revealed and what pride concealed. The Japanese Navy had not been defeated at sea first. It had been defeated on paper, in the quiet corridors where truth had been written and then sealed away. The Pacific calmed again, but the silence carried memory. The lesson endured like the tide itself, that understanding an enemy requires more than data, it requires imagination. The empire that failed to imagine its opponent's capacity to grow had built its strategy on a reflection rather than a reality. And in that reflection, long before the bombs fell and the fires rose, the war had already been lost.